Here is a sentence that usually makes people angry, not because it is cruel, not because it excuses violence, but because it points in an uncomfortable direction. The Mafia didn't destroy society, it replaced a broken one. That does not make it good, it does not make it right, and it certainly does not make it noble. It makes it effective. Because the Mafia did not rise in moments of chaos, it rose in moments of absence. When laws existed on paper, but protection did not exist in practice. Where courts were distant, where police were unfamiliar, where promises of safety arrived late, if they arrived at all. Fear has a way of organizing people when institutions cannot, and power, real power, rarely announces itself with banners or speeches. It arrives quietly, through favors, through consequences, through the simple, terrifying promise that someone will respond when no one else does. Long before the Mafia had suits, code words, or mythologies built by film, it was already performing a role the state had abandoned. Not justice, not fairness, but order. And once people grow used to order, they rarely ask who is providing it, until the price comes due. The story does not begin in America. It does not begin with gangsters or guns or men in tailored suits. It begins on an island that belonged to everyone, and therefore belonged to no one. Sicily spent centuries ruled by distant powers. Empires arrived, extracted what they wanted, and moved on. They collected taxes, they imposed laws. But protection was always someone else's problem. Land was owned by men who never set foot on it. The people who worked that land lived exposed. No police force arrived quickly. No court offered relief. Justice, when it came at all, came late. In that environment, survival required certainty. Not fairness, not morality, just certainty. So protection became local, personal, enforced by men whose authority came not from badges, but from reputation. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone understood the cost of defiance. This was not chaos filling the gap. It was structure. And once structure exists, people begin to rely on it. That reliance is where power begins. Protection, once offered, rarely remains optional. At first, it looks like help, a favor, a presence that keeps trouble away. But favors create expectations, and expectations, over time, become obligations. Soon, protection is no longer requested, it is assumed. Those who accept it are safe, those who refuse it are not. Payment follows naturally, not always in money, sometimes in loyalty, sometimes in silence. This is where protection stops being a service and becomes a system. Violence is no longer emotional, it is deliberate, measured, applied only when necessary, enough to teach, enough to warn, enough to remind everyone who is in charge. The men providing protection do not need to explain themselves. Their authority is already understood. What began as safety hardens into control, and control, once normalized, no longer looks like coercion. It looks like order. Omerta is often described as honor. That word sounds clean, respectable, almost noble. But honor was never the point. Omerta was not loyalty to criminals. It was a calculation made by ordinary people. Speaking to the authorities required faith. Faith that the state would listen. Faith that it would act. Faith that it would protect you afterward. In Sicily, that faith rarely existed. The state was distant, slow, sometimes hostile. The consequences of speaking, however, were immediate. So silence became practical. Silence became inherited, passed quietly from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor. Not because people loved the Mafia, but because they feared abandonment more than they feared crime. Over time, silence stopped feeling like a choice. It felt like common sense. And once silence becomes normal, power no longer needs to shout. It only needs to wait. When people crossed the ocean, they did not leave everything behind. They carried memories, habits, lessons learned in places where survival required adaptation. For many Sicilian immigrants, those lessons were not about crime. They were about how power actually worked when institutions failed. America promised law and opportunity, but in many neighborhoods, those promises arrived unevenly. Police did not speak the language. Courts felt distant. Landlords were powerful. Workers were expendable. In that environment, familiar systems reappeared. Someone to settle disputes, someone to enforce agreements, someone who could be relied upon when official channels could not. The Mafia did not arrive as an invading force. It arrived as a remembered solution. It did not need to conquer new ground. It only needed to recognize where the cracks already were. And once again, order formed where authority hesitated. Then the government tried to legislate morality. Alcohol was banned, but desire was not. The law assumed people would comply. Reality had other plans. Demand did not disappear. It condensed, and anything that condenses gains pressure. Supplying alcohol at scale required organization, routes, storage, protection, silence. This was not street crime. It was infrastructure. The Mafia already understood how to move goods quietly, how to enforce agreements without courts, how to absorb risk and pass the cost downward. What had once been local protection became a national operation. Bootlegging did not make the Mafia violent. It made it efficient, and efficiency is what turns influence into wealth. By the time Prohibition ended, the damage was done. An empire had been built in the shadows, using the state's own law as scaffolding. From the outside, the Mafia appeared stable, organized, disciplined. Families, rules, hierarchies that looked permanent. That image was essential, because belief is a form of control. Inside, however, stability was an illusion. Power attracts challengers. Silence breeds suspicion. Every favor creates a debt, and every debt creates resentment. Trust became a performance. Loyalty became temporary. Survival depended on anticipating betrayal before it arrived. Violence was not constant. It was corrective, used sparingly, publicly enough to be remembered, privately enough to be denied. The Mafia did not endure because it was honorable. It endured because fear was managed carefully, and even then, it was never secure. No system built on intimidation ever is. Today, the Mafia rarely announces itself. It does not need to. Modern power does not rely on spectacle. It relies on access. Construction contracts, waste management, shipping routes, financial instruments that look boring enough to avoid scrutiny. The violence did not disappear. It became optional. Gunfire draws attention. Paperwork does not. Influence is quieter than intimidation and far more durable. What once required fear in the streets now requires relationships in boardrooms. The Mafia did not vanish. It refined itself. Because systems that survive for generations do not resist change. They learn from it. The Mafia did not begin as monsters hiding in shadows. It began as an answer to fear, to abandonment, to institutions that existed in name but not in practice. That does not absolve it. It indicts the conditions that made it necessary. History keeps teaching the same lesson, whether we listen or not. When people lose faith in protection, they seek predictability instead. And predictability, offered consistently, becomes authority. Sometimes that authority wears a uniform. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it does not ask to be recognized at all. The Mafia is not a relic of the past. It is a reminder. That power never disappears. It only changes hands, and it always fills the silence we leave behind.